I'm Rob Welsh. I chair the Heritage Commission here in Lebanon. And we've been getting grants from the Department of Historic Resources in Concord for the last several years. This year we've been working on the mills of Lebanon, particularly those along the Mascoma River, from Lake Mascoma down to the Connecticut, but also a few of the other sites around. And we've been working with Monadnock Archaeological Consulting that is run by my colleague Bob Goodby, who's here. And one of his staff members is Matt Labbe, who's going to talk with you guys today. And Matt's been scouring the historical documents. He's been building on some of the work that we in the Heritage Commission have started years ago, and has really added to what we know about the mills. And so we're going to present some of that today. I want to thank some of the members of the Heritage Commission who are here. Linda Cole is here. Ray and Rebecca Book are here. I'm here. Who else is here? Linda Cole is here. And Greg Schwartz is here. And in addition, we've got quite a number of members of the Historical Society here. Fran Hatchett and Stephanie is here. My gosh, we haven't seen Stephanie at one of these meetings for a while, so that's great to have her back in town. And Lee Hammond is here, and Fran Hatchett, and Betty Pardo. We've got a whole bunch. And Linda Cole is here from the Heritage Commission. The books are here from the Heritage Commission. So we've got a big crowd of local dignitaries. So you be nice to all of them, okay? I want to welcome today my colleagues in archaeology. I've got Bob Goodby, who's my colleague at Franklin Pierce, and his company is Monadnock Archaeological Consulting, if I've got that right. And one of his right-hand men is Matt Labbe, who's going to talk with you today about his work on the historic mills in Lebanon. So Matt went to Franklin Pierce University. Well, it was Franklin Pierce College then. And then he went on for his master's degree at Texas A&M, where he's doing underwater archaeology, right? Well, he kind of got out of the water, and so he's just doing the mills part of it now. But anyway, without further ado, I want to introduce him and let him talk about some of the mills work. Thanks.
First, I promise I will not speak for the entire 2 hours. But I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about what I do, since many people aren't really familiar with what archaeology is. So when I tell people I'm an archaeologist, I usually get one of two responses. The first is, I don't know what that is. And the second is, oh, like Indiana Jones. Now, it's true that most of my colleagues were inspired by Indy, but real archaeology is quite different than what the movies portray. Although they're entertaining, movies like these spread a lot of disinformation about what it is that we do. And the reality is the work is usually far more mundane, but it's just as, if not more, interesting. Archaeology is a subfield of anthropology, and the word anthropology comes from the Greek word anthropos, for mankind, and ology, meaning knowledge. So we study the history of mankind. And there are a lot of different ways that we do this. Cultural anthropologists study the intricacies of social interaction. Linguistic anthropologists study the evolution of language. And physical anthropologists look at our anatomy and changes over time. Then there are archaeologists. We study the history of people by looking at the things that they leave behind. And we call these things artifacts. Now, you may call them trash, in which case I would say, yes, I am proud to be a professional garbage picker. And we find these artifacts through careful excavation, because it's not just the objects themselves that have value, but their context as well. Things like where they're found in the soil or their relationship to each other. Archaeology is very similar to the way that detectives look at crime scenes. We look at physical evidence that's left behind, and we make inferences about what happened. It allows us to understand the past in a way that we can't with written records alone. So you've probably heard the phrase, history is written by the victors, and this is just an artsy way of saying that historical writers have their own biases. So for example, a history written by a king would be very different than the history written by his slave. And now, neither is wrong, they're just not complete pictures of what happens. So archaeology allows us to look at history without these biases, because we're looking at physical evidence, not people's interpretation of it. And it allows us to understand the history of marginalized people who don't appear in the historic record, either because they were considered unimportant, or because they were illiterate, or because they weren't allowed a voice in their own society. Now, as I said before, there's a lot of misconceptions about what I do, and the one that frustrates me the most is that I do not dig up dinosaurs. That's a different type of scientist called a paleontologist. Here in New England, archaeologists tend to specialize in either Native American or historical archaeology. And I've done work on both, but historic sites are my real passion. And there's a lot more of these sites than people realize because archaeological surveys are required for any federally funded or permitted project. In other cases, like our mill project, they're funded by grant money for historic preservation. Which brings me to today's subject. MAC was hired to conduct an archaeological survey of water-powered mills here in Lebanon. And the project was funded by a grant from the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources, administered under the direction of the Lebanon Heritage Commission. Lebanon is actually really fortunate to have a body like this. Most towns don't have proactive groups to protect their historic resources, so you should be really proud of the work that they're doing. I'd also like to thank Ed Ashey at the Lebanon Historical Society for helping supply the historic photos for this presentation and for the larger report. The goal of the mill survey was to locate and identify the remains of about 24 water-powered mills around the city. Now, we didn't do any excavation, we were simply locating and identifying sites. And this survey didn't focus exclusively on large-scale textile mills, but looked at all types of water mills ranging from the late 18th to the 20th centuries. For each identified site, we did background research on the history of the parcel, and then we went out and walked each parcel looking for visible and submerged remains. These include both architectural elements, like foundations and dams, as well as features like artifacts and culturally disturbed soils. To date, we've identified 28 different mill sites around the city, and that may not sound like a lot, but these 28 sites actually represent 108 different businesses and owners over the course of 250 years. And the disparity is because people would build new mills over and over on the same spots. To date, we've located archaeological remains on 12 of the 28 sites for a hit rate of about 43%, but we still have a few sites to look at, so that number may go up a little bit. Although the textile industry moved away from New England in the 20th century, mill buildings and factories are still important factors in the economic health of the community. Many extant historic mill sites are being converted for new purposes, offices, industries, shops, galleries, and living spaces. And they're examples of successful mill restoration projects for both commercial use and for tourism, both regionally and around the country. Mill renovations provide jobs, tax revenue, and local investment in addition to their tourism benefits. Other communities have used mill studies to understand environmental changes over time and to even track the toxins that are commonly found on industrial sites. For example, historic dams often have a buildup of contaminated sediments behind them. So knowing where industry was located historically can help us keep track of these contaminants and reduce pollution, helping with environmental conservation efforts. In recent years, there's been a push towards studying industrial sites for the information they provide about the historic labor and the economy. Because at the end of the day, mills are the story of people. Whether it was an early homesteader carving out a new life for his family, or struggling immigrants looking for a better life, mills ran the community, and our way of life today would not have been possible without them. There are several prominent examples of successful mill studies and restorations. Among the earliest of these was the mill at Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. This town was ravaged during the Civil War and the economy collapsed, so during the Reconstruction period, they really wanted to memorialize parts of the city's industrial heritage. Among the sites preserved were a flour mill, an arms factory, and a pulp mill, and it's now a National Historic Site. The 1793 Slater Mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island was turned into a museum in 1925 by businessmen associated with modern manufacturing. In this instance, though, the aim of preserving the mill was to showcase northern industry at a time when a lot of the industry was moving to the southern United States. And it was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1966. During the early Cold War era, there was an overall interest in the history of American industrial prowess. And the best example is the excavation of the 17th century Saugus Iron Works in the 1940s and 50s. After they recovered 5,000 artifacts here, interest in the site grew. So they reconstructed the buildings and turned it into a national park in 1954. And this park is still in operation today, and it brought in over 56,000 visitors in 2016. New Hampshire itself has many well-preserved and unique industrial sites. Many of the large mill cities like Manchester, Nashua, and Dover have adapted to modern uses. In fact, Manchester in particular is seeing really great success in attracting internet and technology companies to its mill district. And I think this is particularly apropos because at the time of their construction, these mills represented the height of technology, and we're still using them for our best technology today. In addition to the large extant mills of the larger mill cities are smaller sites that dot the state with or without standing buildings. The mill district in Harrisville, for example, has been spinning wool yarn since 1794. It was made a historic site in 1977, and it's still considered one of the most intact early 19th century mill districts in the country, not just in New Hampshire. In designing the scope of this work, we also looked at several mill surveys around the state. These include studies like the Lamprey River Survey, which found over 100 mill sites stretching along the 47-mile river, and the Wakefield Mill Survey, which found 18 sites in the town of Wakefield alone. There's also an extensive survey just over the town line in Shaker Village and Enfield. But the research approach to our project was fairly simple. To find these sites, we looked at many different types of sources and started compiling the data into a spreadsheet to track their history and location. Once we took all this information, we tried to tie it into a location in the modern world. In some cases, these sites were very clear. Other times, their descriptions are really ambiguous. And there are a few sites that we know existed, we just don't know exactly where they were located. So we looked at town histories, maps, deeds, and manuscripts, each with their own benefits and limitations. The historic record is not perfect, so it really helps to cobble information from as many places as possible. The walkovers provided their own challenges, as you can see here. This is me stuck in the mud on East Wilder Road. We needed landowner permission to access a few of the sites, but many were already on city land by virtue of being located next to a municipally controlled water source, or within an already designated conservation area. We did the walkovers in April because the trees aren't really open yet, and it's much easier to see remains out in the forest. The only major problem we ran into was the snow cover. It started really early this year and never seemed to end. And it meant a late start for our field work, but it gave us a lot more time to work on the background research. So when you think of the word mill, you probably have an image of the large textile mills of the late 19th century. Places like the Mascoma Mills or Amoskeag or Lowell. But mills come in many different forms that have a long and varied history. The word mill comes from the Latin word mollare, meaning to grind, and they've been built since at least classical antiquity. They're referenced in the holy books of many religions, and we even find hand mills on Native American sites. So this technology continued to develop through the Roman period and into the Middle Ages, and naturally, when Europeans made their way here, they brought this technology with them, since it's kind of impractical to ship goods across the Atlantic. And it's not just the time or the cost it takes to ship things, but the risk of losing a ship full of food or supplies could destroy a colony. People really needed to be self-sufficient to survive here. Mills particularly were appealing because they could do more work than people much faster. And in most cases, they didn't require much in the way of specialized skills to build or run them. There were times when experts were desirable, like in the case of weavers and skilled grain grinders, but by and large, the profession was accessible to most people with limited training. The release of books like Oliver Evans' Young Millwright's Guide in 1795 helped make these trades even more accessible to the public, in the same way that architectural guides let vernacular building styles spread throughout the country without a large pool of dedicated architects. Now, the first known mills built in New England were a salt mill in South Berwick, Maine in 1630, and a pounding mill in Plymouth, Mass. In 1631 that's used for processing grain. Most of these were water-powered mills, but in places like Cape Cod or Rhode Island where you don't have great water sources, windmills became the norm. And we do see a pattern to the development. Over and over again, we see the sawmill, the grist mill, and the fulling mill as the basis of all early industry in a colonial town. As mills got larger at the end of the 19th century, we start to see the words mill and factory used interchangeably. And the difference between the two has become conflated over time because they both use the same kinds of same power sources. Now, the best way we've found to separate the two is that the material that comes out of mill is fundamentally the same as what goes in. It's just in a different form. Whereas in a factory, you're getting composite materials back. You may take wood and nails and a coffin comes out. In essence, a mill does a part of the production, but the factory does the entire process from raw material to finished product. The word factory is a shortened version of the word manufactory, a place where people made goods using machines. And this could refer to either a single building or a complex of associated structures. This system of production was on a scale unlike anything seen before in the past. And so the factory represented one of the only new architectural styles developed after the European Renaissance. Development was slow until the Industrial Revolution, but grew quickly, utilizing new ideas about time, space, and labor. And because factories were functional structures rather than just buildings to be occupied, their design was based primarily on the needs of the machines in the millwright rather than decorative elements that architects would provide. It's important to make the distinction between the two types of structures, though, because if we included any type of manufacturing in this study, I think our list of sites would almost double. Early villages were largely self-sustaining. Items like salt, sugar, and iron had to be imported, but everything else was manufactured locally. Grain, wood, and wool can be processed by hand, but by its very nature, establishing a colony means an immediate labor shortage. And so it's easy to see how automated systems that eliminated time-draining labor became an appealing method of processing natural resources. The earliest mills were necessary to provide daily subsistence to settlers. And to this end, many towns offered all kinds of special privileges like tax breaks, land grants, subsidies, limited monopolies, all of which would encourage the growth of mills. And this exact situation happened in Lebanon when the town assessed taxes to fund the first saw and grist mills in town. Later mills, like Lebanon's own linseed oil mill, were less important to the subsistence of the town and were more focused on profit, and so they did not get the same perks. Now, while water power is a renewable resource, it is limited, and as a result, legal squabbles often erupted over the rights to water privileges. For example, a small privately owned mill might accuse the larger mill upstream of stealing all the water. And as a result, mill privileges were legally designated to allow abutting landowners to seek reparations if a mill impeded their water flow or flooded their land. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the engineering of mills because it's really, really boring, but I thought it would be useful to have a basic understanding of how they work. A water mill turns potential energy of a waterfall into kinetic energy through gravity. The water pours onto a wheel or onto a turbine, and it turns a machine with that power. And this does a useful task like grinding grain or sawing wood. And there are several different types of wheels, each with their own benefits and drawbacks. Overshot wheels, for example, require a really tall waterfall to function. So in Lebanon, the breast and undershot wheels are the most common types. In the 1820s, we also see the invention of the water turbine, which is an enclosed water wheel. It's mounted horizontally, and the force of the water can spin the wheel much faster than a conventional water wheel. The ideal mill site needed sufficient water power and a landscape that would allow that water power to be harnessed via dam and mill pond. One of the major side effects of clearing all the trees in the northern forest is that the trees hold water like a sponge. So when you deforest the area, the rivers and streams see a variable water level, which is not helpful for mill owners. So when faced with this problem, the mill owner's only solution was to build a dam and mill pond. The dam retains the water coming downstream, and the mill pond holds it as a reserve source. So the first type of mill built in a newly settled town was the sawmill. The colonies needed huge amounts of timber to literally build their towns from scratch, and as a result, sawmills were opened all over the colonies. When shipbuilding commenced at Portsmouth, the need for sawmills in New Hampshire expanded even further. Now, sawmills were virtually unheard of in England. In fact, the first one wasn't built there until the 1660s, even though the technology was popular in other countries. And it wasn't that the English were gluttons for manual labor, but they had a very strong woodcarvers union. And they were really resistant to automated technology because they thought it would take their jobs away. And if you think about it, that's not very different to how we feel today about computers and robotic manufacturing. We have to remember that history is a cycle, and the problems of the past can be used to solve problems today. But despite their unpopularity in England, the Crown recognized that sawmills would be necessary in the new colonies due to labor shortages. So the sawmill caught on quickly, and the technology continued to improve over the years. For example, you have interesting inventions like the gang saw here on the right, which could cut multiple boards at the same time. And by the end of the 19th century, we see the introduction of the circular saw blade, which can work much faster and more efficiently than a vertical saw blade. After lumber was cleared and farms were starting to be settled, came the introduction of the grist mill for grinding grain. Grains were a staple commodity for both humans and for livestock. They needed these things to eat. And something to remember, you could not buy prepackaged sliced bread until 1928. So the grist mill remained important well into the 20th century. Like lumber, the grain had to be processed locally because shipping flour and feed was not practical due to poor transportation networks. There's an early story here in town that illustrates this point really well. Before Lebanon's first grist mill was built, you had to go down to Charleston to get your grain ground. And at the time, that was a dangerous journey of several days. So there was a gentleman that needed to grind his grain, and he walked down to Charleston, and he found that the mill was not in operation. It was broken. And so he had to keep continuing south until he found a working grist mill. And he made it all the way to the Massachusetts border before he found one. So when he returned several weeks later, his family was ecstatic. They thought he had drowned in the river and was never coming home again. Now, the gristmill process works by feeding grains between two stones that have channels cut through them at complementary angles. And these cut the grain like scissors. The meal would run out of the channels into a box where you could sift the good meal from the chaff. In some ways, grinding grain required more skill than sawing logs because the grain vendor needed both technical and commercial skills. The value of grain was dependent on the quality of the milling, and so farmers wanted access to a well-equipped mill with a competent owner. A grist mill also requires more capital investment than nearly any other type of industry at the time because of two large costs. The first of which is the grinding stones themselves. Different types of stones produce different qualities of meal, so they were often imported rather than being cut locally. And the second, the architectural requirements of the grist mill were very different from other mills because they required a much stronger foundation, because any vibration of the building could throw the stones out of alignment. And because of the substantial construction, many grist mill buildings still survive to the present day, even if they aren't used for their original purpose. Now, the grain industry in Lebanon was strong enough to support several grist mills, as well as more specialized grinding mills that processed things like clover seed and linseed oil. And one of the great things about grist mills is that they could be easily converted to process other items like spices or drugs or pigments and even gunpowder. The final type of mill of critical importance to the early town was the fulling mill. Fulling is a way of cleaning the dirt, oils, and excrement from raw wool. Importing fabric became really problematic leading up to the Revolution, and so people produced their own fabrics at home on hand looms. Fulling was really hard work, and so sometimes it would be done in public parties like we see here on the left. But as you can tell from this older woman, it really wasn't very much fun. And so people turned again to water power for their answer. The fulling mill used a water wheel to move beaters, or later rollers, that would clean the fabric. In 1779, Lebanon voted to set aside land for a cloth mill in West Lebanon along Trews Brook. And it was taken up by Daniel and David Hinckley, who were already operating an existing sawmill there. The need for the carding mill is a testament to the success of early farmers establishing animal stocks, and it suggests that a considerable amount of land had been cleared in just 20 years since the founding of the town. And a nearby tannery opened by William Osgood in 1790 shows the same for beef stocks. So now that we know a little bit about what these mills are, we can talk about how this all applies specifically to Lebanon. Lebanon was one of 60 towns established by Governor Bennett Mills in 1761, but its settlement goes back much farther than that. Almost 10,000 years earlier, actually. This area was first settled by Native Americans shortly after the end of the last ice age, and the ice age formed our area, rivers, and lakes. Like the Europeans that came later, Native American people were attracted by the natural resources of the area. One of their favorite spots were along the area rivers where there was abundant food. And these photos, for example, are from a site here in the Upper Valley that we excavated a few years back. We found that they were especially attracted to the natural falls in the river where they could easily catch fish. And these same falls were the places where Europeans later decided to set up their mills. So these two groups of people were attracted to the same spots, but for very different reasons. So when we look at mill sites, we always have to consider the possibility that there are also buried Native American artifacts. Now, these types of sites don't tend to have remains on the surface, so we look to the environment for clues to guide us. We look for generally flat areas with well-drained soils. They also like to be between resources. So if you had, say, a nice sandy area between a river and a swamp, that's the place to look. We also use the soil core to look at the color and texture of the soil, which we can use to determine if a site has been dug up in the past or not. Now, as you know, the settlement of America was one of conflict. Before the French and Indian War, the area around Lebanon simply wasn't safe for European colonization. Still, soldiers fighting on the frontier passed through the area and noted the abundance of natural resources. A fort was established at Charleston in the 1740s to give the English a toehold in the area. And when hostilities ended in 1760, the area quickly opened up for settlement. Lebanon was one of dozens of towns granted around the same time, and it became an attractive destination for the veterans who had passed through here years before. Now, I cannot stress enough how isolated Lebanon was from other European settlements. Now, I want you to imagine, if you will, it's the middle of the 18th century, and you're going to make your way from your home in Connecticut, where most of the first settlers came from, up into the New Hampshire forests. There are no roads as we know them today, and so you start out on these rough cart paths that were built by your ancestors. As you move into the wilderness, the cart paths turn into narrow footpaths that are laid out by Indians and maintained by deer. Eventually, even these paths become impassable, and you have to take a canoe up the Connecticut River. Now keep in mind, this whole time you're traveling with everything you need to survive, all of your supplies. Most of your family has never been more than a few days' journey from their house, and certainly never been outside the confines of a protected community. The forests, like the picture on the left, are dense, dark, and full of dangerous animals. At any moment, bands of Indians could come rushing out of the woods to kill or abduct anyone in your party. If you're injured, there's no one to tend your wounds. And if you get lost, there's no settlements to the north or the west, and you vanish into the forest forever. If you run out of supplies at your new home, the nearest outpost is at Fort Charleston, which is over 30 miles away. You're looking at a 5-day journey on foot. Naturally, you need a community that's entirely self-sustaining, and this is where the impetus to create mills comes from. It's not just a desire, but an absolute need to be able to take care of your own. Your life literally depends on your ability to process raw natural resources. The French and Indian War officially ended 2 years after the town was founded, and the surrounding area came under the control of the British, making the region safe for the first time in over a century. Land was cheap and fertile, and so the benefits of making the journey north finally outweighed the risks. Farms required extensive land preparation before people could live there permanently. Typically, men would leave their families in the spring and spend the summers clearing land. Women would remain on the old homestead with the younger children and tend the old farm in the meantime. Now, this first year must have been particularly challenging because there's no permanent structures and there's no crops to sustain you food-wise, and so you're living off hunting and gathering in temporary shelters. One person alone could clear about 1 to 3 acres of wood a year, and more so if you came with brothers or older sons. And it usually took at least 2 years to make a viable farm plot. In addition, the people in the area worked together on making passable roads so that large draft animals could be brought up for the farms. In Lebanon, the first of these was a road to Charleston, which roughly followed what we would call 12A today. The Connecticut River was the closest thing they had to a highway, and so they always wanted to keep the road close to the river so that they could have boat launches and ferry landings. Now, the wood cleared from road and farm plots was used to literally build the town from scratch, so sawmills were in immediate need. They allowed them to process material not just for houses, but for things like stables and meeting halls, bridges, and even other mills. The wood for that first mill, though, had to be shipped down to Charleston for processing, which is not an easy task. So the first of these granted in Lebanon was given to Oliver Davison in March of 1762, just a few months after the town was founded. In fact, at the time, town meetings were still being held in Connecticut, where a lot of the settlers had come from. The chosen site was located at the west end of Miracle Mile, where the bridge crosses the river. And this bridge was first built in 1769, and it's been rebuilt several times. And when I went down there to do the walkovers, we were actually able to find a lot of the earlier bridge abutments. There were actually a couple times during this project where we found non-mill sites, but we decided to record them anyway because there's a chance that they could be destroyed before anyone else finds them again. Around the same time the bridge was built, Oliver Davison passed away. And we know the mill remained in operation because in 1770 it burned down and was immediately rebuilt by his estate. By 1775, it had passed to Thomas Blake, who was a joiner by trade. And after the war, he moved to Boston, where he opened a soap and candle shop. Blake sold the mill to a group of about half a dozen investors, one of which was George,
for whom Hubbard's Bridge was named.
They built a grist mill adjacent to the sawmill. And in the 1810s, Thomas Ray bought the property, and he built a carding mill on the site for processing wool. His deeds also note the presence of a malt house on the site. So you can see that within just a few decades, this site grew from a subsistence sawmill to a complex of several commercial enterprises. Now, there are no references to the mills after the 1840s, and they're entirely absent from the 1860 map. Now, unfortunately, this site has been entirely destroyed by the modern bridge, by updates to the dam over the years, by the construction of the railroad north of the site, and by modern commercial development to the east. And I was really disappointed that this site was gone, but it did give us a neat little surprise. It was a really nice day out when I was surveying, so I decided to take a walk north onto the conservation land to see if there was anything left of the old dam in that location. And I not only found the dam, but I found another neat site as well. So this isn't a mill at all. This is another type of water-powered machine. This is a power station built by the Mascoma Heat, Light, and Power Company in 1892. And it was the second power station ever built in the town. Now, I haven't found any historic photos of this site, so if anyone knows of any, please let me know. There was a dam located here that directed water into the building where it would enter the structure and turn turbines that generated the electricity. And it remained in operation until about 1960. It's hard to see because it's kind of overgrown now. It's covered in a lot of bittersweet. So if you were to go down this type of year, you may not see it so well. But it is open to the public if you want to visit. I wanted to include this for a couple reasons, though. Partly because I think it's kind of cool, but also because it illustrates how long water power remained a critical resource in the area. It also shows how sometimes there's overlap between the concept of mills and factories and utilities. The first grist mill in town was granted in 1764 to John Bennett, just 2 years after the town was founded. Like the Davison sawmill, it was built with tax revenue. By this time, farms had been established and they were producing enough locally that they didn't have to bring stuff to Charleston. They wanted to grind it themselves. Unfortunately, nothing is really known about Mr. Bennett's life. We do know that the mill was taken up by Jonathan Dana in the 1770s, but again, he didn't remain very long, and so we don't know much about him. But in 1792, the mill was taken over by Joshua Markham, who came from Enfield. And he appears on the tax list for the first time in 1800, so he took it up about that time. He ran the mill until 1808, after which time he moved to Vermont, and he remained there until his death in 1817. In 1809, the mill was purchased by a group of investors, including centenarian Joseph Wood, who was involved in many mills around town. They built a sawmill next to the grist mill and had great success cutting and shipping first-growth pine down the Connecticut. In addition to running the mill, Captain Wood ran his family farm, he ran a tavern, and he worked on the turnpike, and he served in several different town positions. It was said that he had to be up so early for work that he would rouse his family by dropping a heavy iron shovel on the fireplace hearth every morning. Now, there's no record of whether or not his family appreciated this, but I think we all know the answer. In 1836, part of the lot was granted to Roswell Sartwell, who built a cotton mill. And after Captain Wood retired, the mill passed through several owners before coming into the possession of William Osgood of Claremont. Osgood hired a bookkeeper who might sound pretty familiar to local residents. His name was John K. Buttman, and that is where we get the village of Buttmanville. In 1860, his mill was processing 13,200 pounds of cornmeal a year, and the sawmill was processing 250,000 board feet of wood. So these were substantial operations, but each of them was only run by a single employee. The mills switched owners several times again, and by the 1870s they were owned by Thomas Waterman. A fire destroyed the sawmill in 1881, but it was rebuilt as a box factory. The grist mill was rebuilt at this time as well, and business continued to boom. Eventually, they built an axe handle shop on the property as well. The mills appear to have gone out of business in the early 1900s, and in 1922, the site became home to the number 4 power station. Today, you know the area as the site of the Powerhouse Mall. And as you can see, it bears almost no resemblance to the historic photos of Waterman's mill. Nearly all trace of the mills has been destroyed, and we would not consider this site archaeologically sensitive. Sometimes you do find remains under parking lots, but in this case, I think the site has been pretty hammered. The only evidence of the site left is this mound in the river right here, and those form downstream from water wheels when dirt and debris gets thrown through the wheel. The only historic remains are the standing brick buildings of the number 4 power station. Now, these buildings are historic in their own right and may be eligible for the National Register, but that's something that would have to be assessed by a qualified architectural historian. But the one good thing about the complex is that it really pays homage to the history of the site. You can see a grist stone mounted in the walkway of Louis Louis, for example, and mill machinery along the road at the entrance. Even the name Powerhouse is a reference to the history of the site. The Huckins Storrs mill is another example of an 18th century sawmill that saw use for over 100 years. And this
one is found in the conservation area called True's
Ledges. And if you walk down there, you can see the remains for yourself. You can see in the middle photo that the mill straddled a natural hollow in the rocks, and this is where the mechanism for the water wheel was located. And it looks like they channeled the water from above the falls, and it dropped onto an overshot wheel here. This was a neighborhood that had its own little industrial center in the early 1800s. It had the sawmill as well as a grist mill and a cloth dressing mill. The sawmill was in operation by 1775, possibly as early as 1767. The owner, Huckins Storrs, was born in Mansfield, Connecticut in 1732. He was one of the first settlers of Lebanon, but he didn't stay long. He moved to Royalton, Vermont, where he died in 1786. Around 1779, he sold the lot to Daniel and David Hinckley, who built the town's first fulling mill next to the sawmill. This mill was destroyed by a flood in 1829, and only the sawmill was rebuilt because by that time the textile industry was moving to the center and to East Lebanon. By the late 1800s, the mill came into possession of the Stockwell family, and it went out of business shortly after Leonard Stockwell died in 1891. So I went and visited the park at True's Ledges, and I found that the mill foundation was readily visible. There's also a nice piece of land northwest of the foundation that was probably used as a work yard. Now, this foundation isn't in great condition. It's collapsing a bit due to erosion and to vandalism, and part of the site has been covered by the retaining wall for the road that goes nearby. There's no evidence whatsoever of the fulling mill, but I think that area has been particularly impacted by bridge construction over the years. But the workyard is of particular interest to me because it is flat and well drained with intact soil. So this is one of those sites where we would consider it sensitive for Native American artifacts too. The site is accessible to the public, so it's really important that the city takes steps to protect it. And I think a good start would be to erect some kind of signage so that people know what they're seeing and why they shouldn't touch it. Sites continued to pop up around the town throughout the late 18th century, and it was said that nearly every water source had at least their own small private sawmill. Unfortunately, mills from this period are really poorly represented. Often, this is because of later dam work. For example, Major John Slapp opened a corn mill around 1767 just downstream from Oliver Davison. But the entire site around this mill has been totally destroyed by the modern iteration of the dam. In other cases, these small mills simply weren't documented at all because they were part of larger family farms and weren't used commercially at all. As the town became more established, mills started to be used for business rather than pure subsistence. And nowhere is this better illustrated than East Lebanon. The area was first settled by Elisha Payne, who is arguably one of the most important people to ever come out of Lebanon. Payne was born in Canterbury, Connecticut in 1731 and
attended Yale College.
in 1774 he moved to Orange, New Hampshire, where he built his first sawmill. Shortly thereafter, he moved to Enfield, where he built the Paddleford Mills. Now, Payne was extremely active in state and regional affairs. He was a member of the Connecticut Assembly during his youth, and he later became a representative for both New Hampshire and Vermont, even though he never actually lived in Vermont. He was also a New Hampshire state senator. He served on the New Hampshire delegation to approve the Constitution, and he was really involved in the delineation of the Vermont and New Hampshire border, for which there was a lot of conflict. He also served as lieutenant governor of the Vermont Republic when they tried to secede, and later was the chief justice on their state Supreme Court. He also held several other positions of lesser importance. Around 1780, he was able to purchase hundreds and hundreds of acres of land at the outlet of Lake Mascoma. And he built the first dam at this location and also built a sawmill. And this mill would end up furnishing some of the lumber for Dartmouth College. He also had a store and a post office, which were run by John Winnick and John Ralston. He later expanded operations with the construction of a grist mill on the property. The area was further developed in the 1790s when James Ralston and Thomas Ray founded the Mascomie Manufacturing Company for processing wool on the west side of Payne Road. With these businesses established, East Lebanon became a major manufacturing center. In fact, it was so important that for a long time the village itself was often referred to as the city. The mill passed through several owners after Payne's death in 1807, and business continued until the winter of 1840, when a massive fire destroyed the village. Industry never really recovered in the area because the business owners at the center had formed a coalition to purchase all of the water rights, preventing people from rebuilding in this location. Now, William Haskell wanted to build a sawmill on the old Payne property, so he decided if you can't beat him, join him. So he joined the coalition, and he was able to negotiate a deal to build a sawmill on the old Payne mill site. He manufactured furniture for schools, and this remained in operation until sometime before 1892. Unfortunately, there's not much trace of any of the East Lebanon mills, which is unfortunate because the area is really poorly documented. That fire that destroyed it predates all of the sources that we would use to study the area, including detailed census records, maps, and city directories. The other important sawmill on the east side of town is the Ichabod Packard Mill. This is the one that Karen's looking for. This is probably my favorite of the sites that we've found. The thing I love about this site is that its whole history has been documented photographically. So we've got a picture on the left of it in operation. We have a picture when it was abandoned, and we have a picture after it had rotted away. And the middle picture is particularly interesting to me because the historic record clearly states that the mill was torn down. But what we actually see is that they salvaged it of all its usable parts and then left the rest to rot. Now, Ichabod Packard built
Saw and grist mills near what we call Chandler Bridge around 1800.
He was born in Bridgewater, Mass. in 1751. He married Rachel Chamberlain in 1780, and they moved to Lebanon shortly thereafter. Packard died in March 1840, and the mills passed to Joel Chandler. Now, nothing is known of Joel Chandler's personal life, but this mill was the last vertical sawmill in town, the others having been converted to circular saws by that time. The covered railroad bridge in the middle, adjacent to the site, was built in 1865. but some teenagers with matches caused it to collapse in 1890 because some things never change. The freight train Atlantic was actually nearly lost going over the bridge during the collapse, but it was able to cross just moments before the bridge came down. And the bridge was such an important thoroughfare for the railroad that they had a temporary replacement bridge built by the next morning. So when I did the walkover, I did find the remains of both the mill and the associated house, as well as outbuildings and the workyard. With nice, well-drained soil and flat topography, this is another site that we would consider sensitive for Native American sites. The way the site is located has and will continue to protect it from any development, but it is located on private property. Now, the Heritage Commission has expressed interest in conducting an archaeological field school, and if we could get permission, this would absolutely be the perfect site. Meanwhile, along the Connecticut River, lumbering was becoming a huge industry for the town. The area above Wilder Dam is naturally 3 distinct falls, and there were sawmills placed on both sides of the river at the middle falls as early as 1784. Lumber was cut and floated downstream as rafts to be sold in Connecticut and New York. Now, there are several falls along the length of the river, which made it really difficult to transport the lumber safely. A person literally had to sit on top of the piles of logs and guide them over the falls. Obviously, these people took a large paycheck, and so after a while, they decided this was just too dangerous, and so they needed another solution. And what they decided was they were going to start to build canals around all of the falls and the rivers.
So that the lumber could be shipped
more quickly and safely. So in 1807, the White River Falls Company was founded by Mills Olcott of Hanover, and he started building the canal in Lebanon. It was completed in 1810, and it was an immediate financial success. The toll was $2 per boat and $1 per ton for lumber, merchandise, and produce. In 1817, he was able to purchase all the mills on both sides of the river. Now, the canal remained in operation until the 1840s, when the railroad came to New Hampshire and Vermont. Trains were a cheaper and faster means of transporting goods, and so they started leeching business away from the canals. The canals were eventually abandoned in the 1850s, and they fell into disrepair. Still, the area remained important for its water power, and a carpet weaving mill was built near the sawmills in the 1840s. In 1881, the mills were purchased and renamed the Olcott Falls Company. A pulp mill for paper production was built on the New Hampshire side, and this pulp would be shipped over to the Vermont side to a paper mill. These remained in operation until the current dam was built. Wilder Dam was completed in 1950, and its reservoir extends 45 miles up the Connecticut River. It raised the water level significantly, and even projects in the last decade have raised the water level an additional 2.5 feet. So we knew going into this that this site was probably either destroyed or submerged. Now, some archaeology has been done in that area before. A survey of the riverbank a few years ago located the remains of the old Iron Truss Bridge that was just south of the mills. And this was helpful in trying to figure out exactly where the mill was located, since the topography has changed so much over the last 60 or 70 years. We determined that the site was located near the boat launch on East Wilder Road, where you saw my car earlier. Sure enough, remains were visible in the water, and there were a couple small features on land. Since it was too cold to swim in April, I can't tell you exactly what's under the water, but maybe ask me again in late summer. Ideally, we would have a diver go out there and map out the remains. And I can tell you that submerged sites are extremely expensive to excavate, so most of the time it's not really worth the trouble. But if they ever lower the water level for dam work, this is definitely a place where someone should get out and assess what's left. For the time being, the site's pretty well protected as it is. Remains on land were limited to a cart path and a few loose bricks, so nothing terribly exciting. So we've seen the development of both East and West Lebanon, but we haven't really talked much about the city center. By the late 19th century, it was the most developed area of town, but it was actually the last of the villages to develop commercial manufacturing. West Lebanon was settled first because people were coming up the Connecticut River. East Lebanon was settled next as people were trying to harness the water power of the lake. So at the time, the center had no clear advantage over the other two areas, other than being the geographic center of town. People did live here, though. We know there was a tavern here as early as 1767, which shows that people were at least passing through the area. The road system was very poor at the time. They were narrow, ungraded, often muddy and inaccessible. But when the turnpike system was established at the end of the century became accessible to commercial manufacture. Construction of mills began in 1794, and there were 5 mills by the end of the century. These were a sawmill, grist mill, fulling mill, carding mill, and linseed oil mill. Unfortunately, the area was so developed that only one of these shows any trace today. And this is the Shaw grist mill, which happens to be the oldest of the 5. The grist mill was built in 1794 by Thomas Hoe and Thomas Lathrop. And the mill would go on to be one of the longest running in town, operating almost uninterrupted from the 18th to the 20th centuries. It's also one of the best documented because one of the later owners, C.C. Benton, was an amateur historian who wrote about the mill extensively. The original building was a single-story structure with water wheels that ran 2 runs of stones. And at the time, the dam was located further north than the 20th century iteration that some of you might remember. So they had to carve a small canal from the dam to the building to power the wheels. In 1813, Thomas Hoe bought out his partner and sold his share to Brackett Greenough, who moved the building to a new location. We don't know where this location is. I have a suspicion, but I can't prove it. A new grist mill was built. This building was 36 by 26 feet, and it was built on the same spot. And it accommodated 4 runs of stones, doubling the mill's production. Eventually, the mill passed to Dr. Phineas Parkhurst, who was born in Plainfield, Connecticut in 1759. Dr. Parkhurst was shot during an Indian raid in Royalton in 1780, and this event would really change his life. First, it inspired him to become a doctor. He ended up specializing in obstetrics, and he delivered over 3,000 babies during his career. So if you don't think one person can make a difference, this is proof that you are wrong. The other thing was that the gunshot that he received to the abdomen prevented him from being a farmer. He just couldn't do the physical labor. And this is what inspired him to take up another trade, namely investing in a lot of the local area mills. So he owned this grist mill and several others until his death in 1844. The mill passed through several more owners until it burned down in February of 1871. It was rebuilt and passed to W.F. Shaw, but it was lost again in the 1887 fire, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. Again, it was immediately rebuilt. So if you're keeping count, this is the 4th time they had to rebuild this building. And the mill passed to its last known owner, A.H. Hill, about 1904. And it remained standing until the 1964 fire, which destroyed it for good. Now, because C.C. Benton wrote about his time at the mill and other people's times about it, there's lots of great stories about the people who worked there. And one of my favorite is a story from about 1810, and it involves miller Daniel Dustin and his son Jonathan. So one day, Jonathan and his friend Jedediah Aldrich were hanging out in the mill just chatting. And unbeknownst to them, Daniel was in the next room over, kind of watching them unheard. So he decided to play a joke on the boys. And he took a stick and he poked Aldrich through the door with the stick. And of course the kid jumped and screamed. He says, "Something's touched me!" And his friend says, "Don't be alarmed, Jed. It's touched me severely a great many times." So it seems like merely an amusing anecdote actually has some really important historical value. It reinforces that mills were used as social centers for the area men. The processing of grain takes time, and over again we see instances where this time was spent socializing in ways that were common in a tavern or in the militia. They were one of the few entirely secular places where people could meet and talk about things that they couldn't in more formalized spaces like the meeting house or government buildings. So today, the mill is the site of a tiny public park. It's a small triangle of land between the river, the road, and the rail trail. And at the far north end of this little park are the remains of the Shaw flour mill. So only parts of the north and west walls remain from the most recent iteration of the building, and the rest has been filled in and leveled. The foundation basically acts as an erosion control feature, and this is something that I saw on quite a few sites, especially in the center of town. The foundation walls of historic buildings were retained if they were already serving a supportive function. And this foundation extends right under the roadway, as we can see in the lower right-hand corner. Yep. But the rest of the building appears to have been destroyed and filled in. There's not much intact soil around the building. The interior has been filled in, and the riverbed
Of large rocks and fill that had been dumped in there over the years.
There are metal pins down by the water, which are evidence of the pre-1887 dam. One of the things I found really interesting about this site is the really poor quality of the cement used for construction. If you remember, I said this building was rebuilt 4 times. And we can tell from the cement that by the end, they were really getting sick of it. They would just throw any old thing they could find into the cement, cobbles of rocks, pieces of iron, whatever it would take to fill it in and do it on the cheap. So this is one of those sites that I don't think it has a ton of archaeological value, but it's a really neat piece of history right in public view. The way the road, the river, and the rail trail sit make this a site that's essentially protected from development permanently. And because it's a park, I think it would be a really great place to put in some signage to educate the community about what was here and why it matters. After the first few mills in the center was established, development really took off. And this map shows most of the mills that would eventually be built in the area, except for a few that shared the same spots over time as later mills. So each of these labels is the most recent version of a mill on that site. So this development was spurred on by several regional changes. By the early 1800s, the really fertile soils of the 18th century were starting to be depleted, and the farm yields were going down every year. And this trend was exacerbated by serious climate problems. In 1815, there was a volcano that exploded, Mount Tambora, which threw so much ash into the atmosphere that it actually lowered temperatures globally. And 1816 was called the year without a summer because they were getting snow in June and all of these awful weather phenomena that were killing all the crops. So this left New England, in addition, land in the Midwest had opened for settlement, and so people started flocking from New England out there to build cheaper farms that had more yield. And this really left the New England economy in a lurch. So the only thing they really had left was their water power, their lumber, and their livestock. Around 1810, a man named William Jarvis, who was the U.S. consul to Lisbon, smuggled about 3,000 merino sheep to his home farm in Vermont. Now these sheep produce large amounts of really fine wool, and the New England farms were ideal places to raise them. So they became so popular in New England, by the 1820s, we started having a sheep craze where everyone had jumped on the sheep market. And the access to huge amounts of raw wool opened up the area to large-scale textile production. In Lebanon, this began with the construction of 2 large mills in the center of town, the Lebanon Cotton and Woolen Factory and the Mechanics Cotton and Woolen Factory in 1814 and 1815, respectively. Now, there's no trace of either of these mills today, but the latter was the same site where the Riverside Mill was later built in 1893. Even as the center grew, the Scytheville neighborhood remained an industrial hub. Additional businesses flocked to the area after the 1840 East Lebanon fire. The first mills in this area, besides Oliver Davison's mill, was a mill that processed clover for animal feed. You take the seeds out and you can feed them to animals. And these were built by Simeon and Eliel Peck. Now, if those names sound familiar, you would be right. The land donated for this very hospital was the same land owned by Alice Peck Day's ancestors, Simeon and Eliel Peck. So literally, if you walk straight south from this building, you will come to the mill site. Unfortunately, the mill site is gone, but in its place is an electrical power station. And there's some stonework still left in the riverbank that acts as erosion control, along with the remains of an early dam in this location. And you can see the dam was cement, and it would have used wooden crib work. You put big pieces of timber through those holes, and then you nail vertical pieces to the back. And so this has either rotted away or more likely was demolished by the city at some point. Slightly downstream from this mill is the remains of the Baxter Machine Company. Now, this is apparently the same set of buildings shown as the Scythe factory on the 1892 map. Baxter moved here after his shop in the town center was destroyed during the 1887 fire. The main building is gone now, but several of the smaller associated buildings are still extant. And there are also some stonework channels in the river. So the Sanborn map shows that the channel connected to an electric power plant. So it was probably used using water power to power a turbine that worked electricity in the mills. So technically it's not a mill per se, it's an electric powered machine, but this is a case where we still recorded the site for the state, so at least they know where it is. I did observe several artifacts eroding out of the riverbank in this location, and these combined with the channels and the standing buildings suggest that the site is significant for both architecture and archaeology.
But it's all private property, and so there's not really much that
We
this
can do with it at this time. The biggest mid-century change was the construction of the Northern Railroad in 1847. I mentioned how this was a very severe blow to the canals in the Connecticut River, but other industries came to rely heavily on the railroad to distribute their goods to the rest of the country. There are several instances, like the Shaw Grist Mill, for example, where a spur track was built off the railroad to directly access the mill. The railroad also allowed several new industries to develop. The biggest among these was woodworking, but there were others as well. Metalwork became important with the construction of a foundry by Martin and James Buck at the center, and the Kendrick and Davis watch key shop on the east side of the river, which is still standing today. This is the older iteration of the building before the fire, though. So this is also when we start to see the construction of the large-scale textile mills that we're all familiar with. Construction on the Mascoma Mill, for example, began in 1882, and it opened the following year to produce flannel. The mill actually began in Manchester, but was enticed to move to Lebanon by generous tax incentives that the town set up to encourage new businesses. By 1886, the 50 women employed there were producing more than 20,000 yards of fabric a year. Young, unmarried women were often hired as mill workers because it gave them a little bit of real-world experience in spending money before the time when they were expected to go home and raise a family. It was kind of popular with a lot of families because the system of mill ownership meant that these women were protected and on a set schedule, and they were overseen. Others were critical of the system, though, because they claimed, quite falsely, that the local brothels would be recruiting girls and that there would be STDs all over town. As with the large woolen mills in other towns, working conditions in the Mascoma mills were always problematic. The workers on the top floor were said to have the best jobs since they were regularly exposed to daylight. What a perk. And the workers in the basement had the worst jobs because not only was it dark, but the dyes used in the basement gave off noxious odors. They had to wear rubber boots to protect against spills and puddles, and the fumes permeated the poorly ventilated buildings. Make no mistake, these buildings were dangerous. The idea of workplace safety did not exist yet, and Lebanon was not spared. I even found an account from the Carter and Rogers mill where a local worker fell into a vat of lye soap and was so severely burned he died several hours later. Still, even as dangerous as they were, these mills were extremely profitable, and this one remained in operation until 1853. Today, the site still exists as the River Mill Development. Its architecture alone probably qualifies it for the National Register, but this is another case where it would need to be looked at by a qualified architectural historian. There is some intact soil along the river that's archaeologically sensitive, but I think overall the value of the site is pretty limited. And it's also another privately owned lot, so there's not a lot we could do with it anyway. Development also extended east of the town. The largest of these structures was the Lebanon Slate Mill, which was founded by Dr. Dixie Crosby in 1867, and it was operated by Elijah Liscombe. This mill was located on the southeast side of the river where Route 4 crosses into East Lebanon. Slate was quarried from the opposite side of the river and brought to the mill to be turned into any number of household objects. The covered bridge in that location was specifically built to accommodate the mill and help transfer resources for production. The 1870 census shows that the mill had a single water wheel that was powering 6 different machines. They employed 5 men and 5 women who processed 100 tons of slate every year. And that slate was valued at $4,200. The company went out of business in the mid-1870s, and the building became the Emerson Edge Tool Company, where scythes and other cutting tools were manufactured. This company had long existed in Lebanon and had moved to this location from this Slayton Hill area right over here. They also operated branches in several other cities. In 1907, the building was sold to Edward Hambleton for his use as a bobbin mill that supplied wooden spools to the area mills. The building burned down in 1909, but the reconstruction had begun by October of that year, the same date inscribed on one of the cement foundations. It continued to operate until the 1920s when the business moved back towards the center of town. And just for the record, I will never speak about the mills of Lebanon without including Dick the Tool Cat. One, because he is awesome, and two, because he illustrates a really important aspect of mill operation. Whenever you have wood shavings or fabric or grain, you are going to have rodents. And so very often mills would keep cats around to keep the mice at bay. And on the right here, you can see this was common enough that it actually made its way into textbooks as folklore, but it rarely appears in the historic record of the mills. And this is a beautiful photo, and I've never seen another instance where a mill cat was treated as another employee. And it's a really special piece, and I have to thank Dr. Robert Welsh at the Heritage Commission for sharing it with me. Today, the site is located along the rail trail on public conservation land, and you can go down and take a look at it if you're so inclined. The site was first identified by our company about 10 years ago, and it was the only mill site in town that was an already known archaeological site. So I visited the site anyway just to check up on its integrity over the last 10 years, and I found that it's doing really well despite having a heavy regular use as a public space. There are preserved remains of several buildings from all phases of the site's use, as well as the abutments for the covered bridge that no longer stands there. And as you can see from the bottom two photos, the history of the site is quite visible in the remains. We have the reddish burns of the fire in 1809 and the restructured cement with its date on the left. This is a really interesting and important site because slate manufacturing is kind of a poorly understood industry. The problem is that its location in the public park could put it at risk. So far, the city has done a really good job protecting it. There's signage about its history, and vandalism is very minimal. So this is one of those places I think that can kind of stay as is.
An unusual business, though, was probably
The American Patent Sponge Works, which was built in 1867 by F.A. Cushman. This was a 5-story building, and the company employed 60 people. This was a factory that imported sea sponges from the Bahamas, and they also purchased the wood shavings from the Sturdivant plant across the river, all of which were turned into stuffing for furniture. They thought this would make really great stuffing because it's much lighter than feathers or hay or horsehair, but there was a very critical flaw in the plan, and that is that sea sponges, by their very nature, retain water. And when they retain water, they start to mold and smell. So when the ad on the left says that it never decays, this was a straight-up lie. And the company ended up going out of business in less than a decade. The building was purchased by Samuel Hale in 1882, and it reopened as a shoddy mill to recycle old fabrics. When Hale was elected governor in 1883, he sold the building to Albert Carter and George Rogers. But the business wasn't in operation very long before tragedy hit. Just after midnight on May 10, 1887, the night watchman noted smoke coming from the lower shops of the Mead Mason Company on the opposite side of the river. He sounded the alarm, but by the time the fire crews arrived, the shops were in a lost cause. The fire spread north, and it crossed at the bridges all the way across the river. And by morning, 80 buildings had been destroyed, 600 people were unemployed, and 40 families found themselves homeless. Fortunately, no one was killed, but the loss to the town was extensive. Fortunately, rebuilding began almost immediately. Colburn Park became a center for donations, and various area groups made living arrangements for the homeless. Sawmill owner T.D. Marston had his sawmill operating within 2 weeks, even though the building itself had not been rebuilt. He just set up his machine and went to town. Insurance claims were settled pretty quickly, and anyone that could claim them did, and business kind of chugged on. But it meant big changes for the town. Carter and Rogers, for example, immediately rebuilt after the fire. They designed a new building which became the Lebanon Woolen Mill, which is still standing today. This mill shut down briefly during the Great Depression, but it was purchased and reopened by Bernard Goldfine in 1932 and it remained in operation until the 1960s. Today, the building is the home of Clean Incorporated. The topography has changed a little bit. It looks as though land in the north end of the site has been built up to make a smoother approach to Mechanic Street. And at the south end of the building is a massive propane unit where you just can't dig even if you want to. So the area around the river, though, is fairly intact. There's evidence of stonework channels, including the large one between the river, between the building and the island and the river. Unfortunately, it's too overgrown, even in the spring, to see much detail. The island itself has a substantial amount of debris. I was able to climb out there, including architectural and furnace bricks. And I suspect at least some of this material is from the old sponge works and shoddy mill building that existed before the fire. It was probably pushed there as demolition debris. There's also evidence of historic trash dumping with all kinds of artifacts from the late 19th and early 20th centuries littering the area. For example, these are 20th century cosmetic and medicine bottles that were just lying around on the surface. So this is a site that has both architectural and archaeological value, but it is another site that is private property. Directly across the river is the Riverside Mill.
There's been textile and wood
Spot since 1815, and it was the location of the Mead, Mason and Sons lower shops where the 1887 fire broke out. The extant building was built in 1893, also by George Rogers, and in 1899 it came under the ownership of the American Woolen Company, like many of the large mills in the area. In the early 20th century, a fifth story was added to the building. During the Great Depression, it was purchased by Bernard Goldfein and rechristened Lebendale, which is how many of you probably remember it. Now, there are several surviving interviews with the workers in this and some of the other area mills during the early 20th century, and these were compiled for a high school project in the 1980s by Kate Braver. And if you go down to the Lebanon Public Library, you can ask them and you can go through and see if you can find your ancestors in there. Lebendale Mills closed in 1962, and it's today owned by the engineering consulting firm called Signal Quest. The rebuilt Kendrick and Davis Key Shop also stands south of the mill, but we didn't focus too much on that site because it's not really a mill, it's more of a machine shop. Archaeologically, the site doesn't have much value. It's largely paved over, and the soil that was accessible showed very clear disturbance. So this is a building that really only has architectural value. It does probably qualify for the National Register on that criterion alone. One of the interesting aspects about it, though, is that there used to be associated buildings on the east side of Water Street that were connected to the mill by a sky bridge. I'm not sure when these were taken down, but this isn't, today they're a parking lot, and you can actually see remains of the foundation walls of these earlier buildings. And this is something I saw in a couple places around town. The most dramatic example of this is at the Everett Knitting Works. The Knitting Works was built in 1891 on the site of the Mead Mason Company upper shops, which were lost in the 1887 fire. This new building abutted the Marston Sawmill, which had been around since at least 1819. The Everett Mill was originally founded in Manchester in 1888, and like other mills was enticed to Lebanon by generous tax incentives. At its peak in 1928, the mill employed about 300 people, most of these women who were engaged in knitting and then sewing. They produced union suits, which are those one-piece pajamas with the butt flap, and they also made other types of knitted underwear for companies like Sears and for the military. The complex also had a shop for making shipping boxes. They had a store that sold irregular garments to locals, and they had a boarding house for the workers that they built in 1897. In 1925, the Everett Mill merged with the Norfolk Knitting Mills of Norfolk, Virginia, but despite the merger, it did not remain financially viable, and it shut its doors for good in 1931. In 1939, after sitting vacant for almost a decade, the mill became the site of the E. Cunnings Tannery, which stood until its demolition in the early 1980s. It's now the location of an apartment complex. And as you can see on the site plan, there are architectural remains of several mills and other structures that are left on the site. Their archaeological value is limited since the soil shows pretty extensive disturbance, but there's something that's actually pretty important to pay attention to here. As I said, mill sites can be a source of very dangerous contaminants, so it's important that we know where sites like this existed in the past. So if you look in the lower right of the site plan, you'll see there's a building marked sulfur storage. Sulfur was used to make dyes for cotton fabrics. It made a really light pale pink color, even though it's a naturally yellow rock. Chemistry, I don't know. It's not poisonous to humans, but it does make water taste and smell really, really bad. And it's also extremely corrosive to metal pipes. So if this were to leach into the river in the past, it could have turned into a big problem for the city's drinking water supply. To be clear, I am not saying that this site is contaminated. I'm merely using it as an example to illustrate why it's so important to keep track of these historic industrial sites. With the arrival of electric power, many older powered water mills simply were driven out of business. They couldn't compete. In addition, the invention of electricity was an impediment to northern mills because it meant that the South could manufacture their own textiles for the first time. They didn't have to ship raw cotton up here. And there was also extensive interest in beefing up Southern manufacturing after the Civil War due to the economic hardships that the war caused. The Great Depression had a marked effect on the end of mills for many towns in New England. Lebanon was very lucky they weren't hit as hard as places like Manchester because the local businesses were successful in obtaining military contracts for the world wars. Even so, business continued to decline with a general trend away from manufacturing in the 1950s. By this time, most of the area mills had been consolidated under the ownership of Bernard Goldfein. Most accounts paint him as a very generous, nice boss, but he was hit with $3 million in liens for tax evasion in 1962, and all of the mills were forced to close for good. Another fire in 1964 changed the landscape again, destroying several historic mills in the process. In the wake of the fire, Hanover Street was rerouted to improve traffic flow, leaving us with the city layout that we see today. With that, our whirlwind tour of the mill era comes to an end. Lebanon was one of the largest mill towns in the Upper Valley, with a reputation for manufacturing dating back over 200 years. Although some mills have been lost to unavoidable development, a tremendous amount of history still exists at over a dozen archaeological sites all over the city. The city has been really proactive in trying to preserve these sites, which are important for both economic development and for environmental considerations. But they're also important because they're the physical embodiments of the people who lived here. These mills were built by people who poured their literal blood, sweat, and tears into their work. They deserve to be remembered, and the preservation of their legacy is something that we can continue for generations to come. And I think that's something that we can all be